Have you ever found yourself drained after spending time with someone, without knowing why? Maybe you walked away from a conversation feeling small, confused, or ashamed, even though no harm was visibly done. And perhaps, like so many others, you've been taught that it's your job to stay kind, stay calm, and stay available, no matter how others treat you.
What if I told you that some personalities don't just hurt you? They hijack your psyche from the inside out. That is what we'll uncover in this video. The 6 most dangerous psychological profiles Carl Jung warned us about, and how to protect your soul from them. Have you ever left a conversation feeling inexplicably tired, as if your very life force had been drained, without a single argument, insult, or demand? You may have just encountered what Carl Jung would call a psychic parasite, someone who doesn't need to harm you to hurt you. Because not all attacks are loud. Some come dressed as helplessness, as endless stories, as subtle glances that beg for your emotional rescue. There is a category of people Jung would warn us about, not because they scream or dominate, but because they cling. They don't take your energy by force. They simply never stop needing you. At first, they seem kind, wounded, misunderstood. They pull at your empathy like it's their last hope. And because you're sensitive, because you care, you open yourself up. You listen, you hold space, you pour into them again and again. But what you don't realize is that the relationship has already become asymmetrical. There's a giver and there's a taker, and the taker never truly receives. They just absorb. Jung described this dynamic through the concept of psychic vampirism, the unconscious draining of another's psychic energy to avoid facing one's own shadow. These people are not evil. They are wounded, but their refusal to confront their pain means you become the host for it. They avoid their own emptiness by staying plugged into yours. They can't sit with their own silence, so they fill yours with endless noise. They do not recharge through solitude. They recharge through your attention. And the price you pay is exhaustion that feels like shame. You start to wonder why you feel responsible for their well-being. Why do you panic when they're sad? Why do you feel guilty when they're disappointed? That is the first symptom. Your energy is no longer your own. You've unconsciously entered a contract that says, "Your stability is my duty." But here is the painful truth Jung would whisper. Anything you give out of guilt will eventually become resentment. So how do you break free? Not by becoming cold, not by abandoning people, but by recognizing that emotional overavailability is not compassion, it's reactivity. It's a form of self-erasure. You stop the drain when you stop making their lack of boundaries your responsibility. When you realize that saving someone from themselves is not love, it's control disguised as care. This is the moment of rupture, the first inner rebellion. You choose silence over reassurance. You choose presence over performance. You choose to let them sit in discomfort without rushing to fix it. And this choice will feel violent, because guilt always screams when it loses power. But what replaces that guilt is clarity. You begin to see the invisible patterns. How you were trained to confuse depletion with goodness, how your kindness became currency in a transaction you never agreed to. And now, for the first time, you reclaim your energy not through confrontation, but through containment. Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But just as terrifying is to accept that not everyone deserves access to your soul. Not every wound is yours to heal. Not every tear is yours to wipe. And not every person who cries in your presence is asking for help. They may simply be feeding off your light because they've lost sight of their own. Now we'll explore the second archetype, the charming manipulator, who uses the power of persona to disarm you. But remember this, your energy is sacred. And the moment you believe that, the thieves lose their power. Have you ever met someone who instantly captivated you? Not with depth, but with polish? They knew what to say, how to say it, and exactly how to make you feel seen, until slowly, something began to feel off. That sense of disconnection, confusion, or even self-doubt is not random. It's the echo of charm without authenticity. Carl Jung warned us about the inflated persona, the social mask we wear to survive, to be accepted, admired, or praised. But some people no longer wear the mask. They've become it. And once that happens, they don't relate to you. They perform for you. These people aren't necessarily bad. They've simply fused their identity with their image. And they'll do anything to protect that image, even if it means sacrificing truth, intimacy, or your trust. The charming mask wearer disarms through polish. Their words are perfect, but their presence is hollow. They mirror your thoughts, compliment your soul, and intuit your insecurities just enough to soothe them, until you begin to lower your guard. But Jung would remind us, what is not conscious becomes manipulative. A person who cannot face their own inadequacy will build a persona so flawless, even you begin to feel like the flawed one. This is where the real danger lies, not in visible harm, but in invisible erosion. You begin to feel small without knowing why. You hesitate to speak freely. You start seeking their approval without understanding how you lost your own. That's the power of persona. It demands performance in return. And you, unknowingly, become part of their stage. The tragedy is this. Behind the charm is often a deep fear of being ordinary, of being unloved, unnoticed, unseen. But instead of confronting that fear, the mask wearer seduces, flatters, exaggerates, anything to avoid true vulnerability. And you, as the audience, are slowly pulled into their illusion. You become addicted to how they see you, but disconnected from how you see yourself. So what's the way out? You stop applauding. You begin to speak truth, not to provoke, but to pierce the performance. You ask real questions. You name what feels missing. You stop filling the silence they fear. And if they pull away, let them. Because when someone values their image more than your connection, the relationship was never mutual to begin with. Jung taught that the persona is a necessary tool, but a dangerous master. We all wear masks, but some people become their mask so completely they can no longer feel. They seduce not because they love, but because they fear being unchosen. They charm not to connect, but to control the narrative. And if you don't wake up, you will spend years mistaking performance for presence. To protect your soul, you must be willing to disappoint the image. You must dare to be real even when the other cannot. Because real love does not require costume changes. And real power is never rehearsed. Now, we'll look at a subtler manipulator. Not the performer, but the guilt weaver. The one who makes you feel responsible for their fragility. Until then, ask yourself this. When someone praises you, do you feel seen or studied? Have you ever felt like saying no would make you a bad person? Like any boundary you set was a betrayal, and any need you had was a burden? That's not your empathy speaking. That's programming, often installed by someone who learned how to make you feel responsible for their emotions. Carl Jung understood the immense psychological force of guilt, not as a signal of true wrongdoing, but as a tool for emotional manipulation when used unconsciously. The person who plays the role of the helpless, the misunderstood, or the consistently disappointed can become the most dangerous to your inner freedom, not through control, but through dependence. This archetype is the master of guilt and obligation. They don't shout, they don't threaten. Instead, they sigh, they sulk, they withdraw. Their silence becomes your punishment. Their sadness becomes your fault. And before you realize it, you're living on emotional eggshells, constantly negotiating between what you feel and what they expect. Jung saw this as a distortion of the child archetype, a person who never evolved past the point of needing to be rescued. Instead of developing resilience, they developed strategies, emotional blackmail dressed as sensitivity, weakness used as leverage. Their pain becomes a currency, and you pay with your energy, your freedom, your time. The most tragic part? This dynamic often begins with love, with the desire to help, to show up, to be kind. But over time, the relationship becomes conditional. If you loved me, you would. You begin to notice that your boundaries make them cold, your needs make them distant, and your independence makes them uncomfortable. So what is really happening here? This person has learned, often unconsciously, that playing small keeps others emotionally close. They weaponize guilt not because they're cruel, but because they're terrified of abandonment. But in doing so, they abandon themselves, and they ask you to carry them. Jung would say, they are projecting their inner helplessness onto the world and demanding rescue instead of responsibility. Breaking this pattern starts with one painful truth. You are not responsible for someone else's inability to grow. Your guilt is not proof of wrongdoing, it's proof of entanglement. And the more you try to explain, to soothe, to accommodate, the deeper you sink into their emotional script. You must rewrite your role. You must learn to say, I see your pain, but I will not betray myself to fix it. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. Because no amount of sacrifice will ever be enough for someone who refuses to carry their own weight. Jung taught that guilt becomes toxic when it replaces conscience, when it no longer guides your morality, but chains your autonomy. And once you see it for what it is, a leash disguised as love, you begin to choose differently. You no longer confuse self-abandonment with kindness. You no longer mistake emotional chaos for depth. And most importantly, you stop apologizing for protecting your peace. Now, we meet a more overt presence. Not the fragile controller, but the grand manipulator, whose charm hides a black hole of self-obsession. Get ready to confront the narcissistic mirror. Have you ever shared something deeply personal, only to feel like the other person used it to make the moment about themselves? As if your feelings were just props in their performance? It starts subtly. A small interruption, a clever twist, a story of their own, until you slowly realize there is no room for you in the conversation. There never was. You've just encountered what Jung might call an archetypal inflation of the ego. Not simply arrogance, but a psychic survival structure that consumes everything in its orbit: attention, empathy, admiration, just to hold itself together. The narcissist doesn't just want to be seen, they need to be reflected. But not as they are, only as the ideal image they've built, polished and defended at all costs. This is the narcissistic mirror, a person who relates not to you, but to how you make them feel about themselves. Their presence feels magnetic at first, confident, intense. They flatter, idealize, and spotlight you, as long as you play the role they've assigned. But the moment you deviate, when your truth threatens their illusion, the warmth turns cold. The admiration becomes indifference. The connection vanishes. Jung understood narcissism not as vanity, but as fragmentation. A disconnection between the persona, the public mask, and the neglected, repressed shadow. What the narcissist cannot face in themselves, they outsource. You become the villain when they feel weak. The failure when they feel insecure. The disappointment when their own illusion begins to crack. Being in a relationship with a narcissist is like standing in front of a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a distorted version of who you are based on their ever-shifting needs. You start questioning your memory, your worth, your emotions. You begin to shrink, to silence, to soften, just to keep the peace. But peace never comes, because what they seek isn't connection. It's control through reflection. They don't want to meet your soul. They want your soul to validate their mask. So how do you survive without becoming like them? You stop explaining. You stop arguing with illusions. You stop trying to be understood by someone who has never developed the capacity to see beyond themselves. You step back, not in anger, but in awareness. You realize that love offered to a narcissist is often used as fuel, not nourishment. And the more you give, the more they burn through you. Jung would say, only what is integrated can be related to. But a narcissist lives in rejection, of pain, of weakness, of anything that might fracture their illusion of superiority. And when someone rejects their own humanity, they cannot honor yours. True self-protection begins the moment you stop trying to be enough for someone who is empty inside. You do not need to fight them. You need to stop feeding the reflection. Because no amount of love will ever complete a mirror that refuses to see its own cracks. And sometimes, the most healing act is not confrontation, it's refusal to play the part. Not with anger, but with quiet, unshakable presence. The kind of presence that says, I no longer belong in your story, because I finally returned to my own. Have you ever felt punished by someone else's pain? As if their suffering became your responsibility, their triggers your fault, their silence your sentence? Not because you did something wrong, but because you happened to be close when their unhealed story got activated. There's a kind of person whose trauma doesn't just live in them, it leaks through them. Carl Jung warned us that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And when that unconscious pain becomes a person's identity, every interaction becomes a reenactment of an old wound. They do not see you. They see their past, projected onto your face. The walking wound doesn't intend to hurt you. That's what makes it so difficult to detect. They're not cruel, they're in pain. But that pain becomes a justification for everything. The withdrawal, the anger, the neediness, the blame. You try to be gentle, to be patient, to hold space. But slowly, you start losing yourself in their emotional fog. They interpret boundaries as rejection. They see disagreement as betrayal. They treat your presence not as a gift, but as a lifeline. And you begin to realize this isn't love. It's survival masked as attachment. Jung saw this pattern as a projection of the rejected shadow. The parts of themselves they cannot accept, fear, rage, shame, get cast outward. Suddenly, you are the one who makes them feel unsafe. You are the one who isn't doing enough. You are the trigger. But in truth, you are simply the mirror. The tragedy is that the walking wound often speaks the language of depth. They talk about healing. They name their trauma. They are emotionally aware, up to the point of transformation. Because real healing requires taking ownership. And ownership is terrifying when the wound has become your identity. So they stay in the loop. Hurt, blame, apologize, repeat. You can't love someone into wholeness. You can't bleed to prove your loyalty. And you cannot sacrifice your inner peace for someone who confuses closeness with salvation. There's a moment, sharp, quiet, holy, when you stop trying to fix. You realize that the wound they carry may be sacred, but it is not yours to carry. That being empathetic does not mean becoming absorbent. That presence is only love when it does not cost you your clarity. Jung taught us that what we repress does not die, it becomes behavior. So when someone refuses to meet their pain with honesty, it will always find another way out. Through manipulation, through withdrawal, through passive punishment. And the closer you stand, the more you become its target. Walking away from this kind of pain does not make you heartless. It means you finally understood that compassion without discernment is a form of self-abandonment. You were not made to be someone else's emotional landfill. You were made to stand whole, even when it means walking alone. And in that silence, something sacred happens. You hear your own voice again, clear, grounded, untouched by the storm. And for the first time in a long time, you remember, you are not here to absorb pain, you are here to alchemize it. Have you ever been with someone who never asked directly, but always expected you to know what they wanted? They didn't demand anything, but somehow you always knew what they needed before they said it. And when you didn't deliver, you felt their disappointment like a silent sentence. This is not kindness. This is control in its softest, most suffocating form. There are people who don't raise their voice, but bend the room. They rely not on dominance, but on fragility. A subtle emotional posture that makes you feel like any wrong move will hurt them. So you become careful, too careful. And in that carefulness, you lose yourself. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the shadow expressions of the anima and animus, the internalized masculine and feminine forces within us. When these are repressed, They distort. The passive controller is often the shadow side of these energies, a false vulnerability used to shape the world around them without ever appearing to do so. They don't take control. They make you feel like you should offer it. And if you are someone with a tender heart, this is the kind of person that will wear you down slowly. You'll think you're being kind, supportive, loving, but deep down you're managing, navigating, performing. True relationship cannot exist in a space where one person must shrink for the other to feel safe. Have you ever felt small in the presence of someone who claims to be awakened? As if your confusion, your pain, your emotional struggle was somehow proof that you hadn't evolved enough. That subtle superiority cloaked in calm tones and poetic wisdom. It doesn't soothe your soul, it shames it. Some people don't seek power through wealth or dominance. They seek it through enlightenment. But not the kind that humbles, the kind that separates, that elevates the image of the self while secretly rejecting the shadow it refuses to face. Carl Jung warned us of this inflation, the danger of replacing egoic ambition with spiritual ambition, where the persona is no longer a mask of social success, but of transcendence. The spiritual seducer speaks in light, but breathes in hierarchy. They use concepts like frequency, alignment, and consciousness, not to liberate others, but to reinforce their position as the one who knows. Their language is beautiful, their posture serene. But beneath the surface lies a deep need to be seen as beyond conflict, beyond confusion, beyond emotion, and the message is always the same. If you were more healed, you wouldn't feel this way. Jung understood this as ego inflation through spiritual bypassing, when a person uses transcendental language to escape psychological integration. They haven't healed, they've floated above the pain, they haven't confronted their shadow, they've painted it white and called it light. And when you bring your rawness, your chaos, your heartbreak to them, you are not met with compassion, you are met with correction. Everything happens for a reason. You're just projecting. You need to raise your vibration. These phrases are not support. They are dismissal dressed in divinity. And the danger is this: they make you doubt your humanity. You begin to feel guilty for feeling, ashamed for being triggered. You mistake emotional suppression for spiritual growth. True spirituality doesn't elevate the self above others. It brings the self into others, with humility, not hierarchy. It holds space for suffering without analysis. It allows not knowing. It listens more than it teaches. It serves more than it shines. The spiritual seducer doesn't want connection. They want reverence. And if you're not careful, you'll confuse their distance for wisdom and their detachment for mastery. But wisdom without warmth is not wisdom. It is isolation with a golden frame. To protect yourself, you must remember this. Enlightenment is not a performance. It is a dismantling. And anyone who uses spirituality to make you feel less evolved is still deeply entangled in their own ego. You are not failing because you feel deeply. You are not broken because you grieve or rage or spiral. You are not behind because you haven't found peace. You are honest, and honesty is holy. Carl Jung said, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." Beware of those who only speak of the sky and deny the soil. They may sound like guides, but they are fleeing from the very darkness that would make them whole. And they will teach you to do the same unless you stop performing and start grounding. Have you ever felt like, no matter what you say, no matter how gently you act, you're always the villain in someone else's story? You try to help. You try to explain. You try to show love in the best way you know how. But somehow, it's never enough. Not because you failed them, but because their entire identity depends on feeling failed. Some people do not seek healing. They seek validation for their hurt. Carl Jung would call this the refusal of individuation, a resistance to the painful process of growth that demands responsibility, not just sympathy. These are not the wounded. They are the entitled wounded. They build their selfhood around what was done to them, and they ask the world to adjust to their scars. This isn't the pain of trauma. That is sacred. That is real. This is the addiction to being wronged. The chronic victim doesn't want to be free. They want you to see them as powerless, forever dependent on your emotional labor, your guilt, your validation. At first, you feel compassion. You want to support them. You listen. You reassure. You carry them. But then something happens. You realize they never move. They never shift. They never grow. Every gesture of help becomes twisted into proof that you still haven't done enough. You say something true. They say you were insensitive. You express a boundary. They say you're abandoning them. You step away to breathe. They call it betrayal. And the most dangerous part, they frame their powerlessness as morality. They speak with the moral weight of the oppressed while holding you hostage with their helplessness. You begin to self-censor. You stop asking for what you need. You contort yourself to fit into their emotional narrative, and still, it isn't enough. Jung taught that the refusal to grow is often cloaked in victimhood, because growth requires letting go of the story. It means stepping into the unknown, taking ownership, facing the parts of ourselves that are complicit in our own suffering. But for some, this is too terrifying. So they stay small and ask you to shrink beside them. If you found yourself exhausted in someone else's healing process, it's time to step back. Not because you don't care, but because caring has turned into enabling. You are not cruel for refusing to play the savior. You are honest for realizing that no amount of presence will ever satisfy someone who's chosen to stay in emotional infancy. You do not owe your energy to someone who weaponizes their wounds. You do not need to become smaller so that someone else can remain unchanged. And you are not responsible for the healing of someone who has built an identity around being unhealed. Real compassion tells the truth. Real love doesn't rescue, it invites. And real boundaries don't hurt people. They reveal who was only there because they could lean on you endlessly. The moment you stop participating in someone's victim narrative, you give them a chance to rise. Whether they take it or not is not your burden. You were never meant to be their crutch. You were meant to be whole. Have you ever noticed how some people agree with everything you say, but somehow you still feel profoundly alone in their presence? They nod. They smile. They affirm every word. Yet beneath all the harmony, there's a strange emptiness, like nothing ever truly meets you there. Because there's no real encounter happening, only reflection, only agreement, only a surface-level simulation of connection. Some people don't show up to relate. They show up to merge. Carl Jung warned us of this subtle loss of self, what he called participation mystique, an unconscious fusion where individuality dissolves into emotional dependency. The echo chamber friend doesn't have opinions. They have mirrors. They shapeshift to match your preferences, your moods, your values, not out of malice, but because they haven't yet found a core of their own. At first, it feels good. So much agreement, so much resonance, but slowly you begin to sense it. There's no tension, no friction, no difference, and therefore no realness. You don't feel seen. You feel repeated. You don't feel challenged. You feel mimicked. And worst of all, you start losing your own voice in the process. Jung believed that real connection only exists when two differentiated selves meet, two distinct identities with boundaries, thoughts, shadows, and light. But the echo chamber friend avoids this tension. They avoid discomfort. They avoid being misunderstood. So they become agreeable to the point of invisibility. They offer validation instead of truth, proximity instead of presence. This kind of relationship is not based on intimacy. It's based on safety. Not the kind that nurtures, but the kind that deadens. You begin to notice that your growth makes them uncomfortable. Your complexity overwhelms them. And every time you take a step into deeper selfhood, they echo back the version of you they already understand. The version that feels familiar, predictable, contained. But your soul wasn't made to be contained. It was made to evolve. And evolution requires contrast. It requires disagreement. It requires the courage to say, I see you, and I also see differently. The danger of the echo chamber is that it teaches you to settle, to mistake reflection for intimacy, to accept sameness as connection. But real connection isn't built on how much someone agrees with you. It's built on whether they can hold their ground and still hold your hand. If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling strangely hollow, it may not be because something went wrong. It may be because nothing real happened. No truth, no tension, no meeting of edges. To reclaim your depth, you must resist the urge to be liked at all costs, and you must also stop confusing being liked with being loved. Because love isn't always an echo. Sometimes it's a challenge, a question, a contradiction that makes you think, makes you feel, makes you return to yourself. Jung reminds us that individuation, the journey to becoming whole, requires separation, and that sometimes the most loving act is to say what's true, even when it disrupts the harmony, especially when that harmony was never real. Have you ever felt judged? Not for what you did, but for what you didn't live up to. As if someone held an invisible scorecard over your head, measuring every word, every silence, every mistake, against a standard you never agreed to. You're not being met, you're being evaluated, and no matter how well you behave, you still fall short. Some people don't argue. They moralize. They don't punish you with rage. They punish you with righteousness. Carl Jung saw this as a dangerous inflation of the superior function. When one aspect of the psyche, often the thinking or judging faculty, becomes so dominant that it turns into a weapon. These are not evil people. They believe they are doing good. And that belief makes them unshakable and profoundly incapable of seeing their own shadow. The moral purist hides behind the illusion of ethical clarity. They speak in absolutes, right and wrong, good and bad, evolved and unevolved. But what they truly seek is not justice, it's control. Control over your choices, your words, even your inner world, achieved not through force, but through the slow erosion of your self-trust. You begin to question yourself constantly. Was I insensitive? Was I selfish? Did I say that wrong? But you're not growing. You're performing. You're contorting yourself into the image of a good person, afraid to step out of line. And that's exactly the trap. Morality becomes a mirror you're always polishing, but never seeing yourself in. The worst part? They rarely say anything directly. They imply, they withdraw, they hint that they're disappointed, but never quite explain why. And because they position themselves as the ethical center of gravity, you instinctively move around them, afraid of becoming the less conscious one. Jung would call this a possession by the persona of righteousness, a self-image so rigid, so elevated, that it can no longer tolerate the messiness of being human. And what the moral purist cannot accept in themselves, they condemn in others. They claim to value truth, but they cannot handle contradiction. They speak of boundaries, but only apply them one way. They say they stand for compassion, but often lack curiosity, the very thing that makes compassion real. To stand near this kind of person too long is to slowly lose your own moral compass. Because instead of checking in with your values, you begin checking in with their reactions. And your integrity becomes performative, a mask you wear to stay safe. But real morality isn't rigid. It breathes. It doubts. It bends without breaking. It doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. And presence cannot exist where judgment lives in the shadows, cloaked in spiritual or intellectual superiority. You are allowed to be human, to make mistakes without confessing them to a tribunal, to have opinions that evolve, to have truths that contradict each other. Because maturity isn't moral purity, it's complexity, it's nuance, it's the sacred discomfort of being alive without all the answers. Jung reminds us, condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. And the moment you stop performing for the righteous, you begin returning to your own internal law, one rooted not in approval, but in wholeness. And wholeness will always be more honest than purity. Have you ever met someone who speaks beautifully about justice, love, and humanity, yet somehow makes you feel utterly unseen? They speak of the collective, of purpose, of higher missions. But when you share your raw human pain, they flinch, they retreat, they abstract, as if your suffering is too ordinary, too messy, too real for their lofty vision. There is a kind of person who loves ideas more than intimacy. They care for the world, but avoid the particular. Carl Jung described this as a distortion of the thinking function, where one escapes the vulnerable chaos of feeling by ascending into abstraction. It is the shadow of idealism, the worship of concepts at the cost of connection. The cold idealist does not hurt you directly. They simply make you feel like your pain is irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. They don't deny your experience. They contextualize it until it loses its emotional weight. You tell them you're hurting, and they tell you about systems. You tell them you're grieving, and they tell you it's all part of a larger plan, not because they're unkind, but because they're uncomfortable. Emotion threatens their clarity. Vulnerability disrupts their structure, and so they choose distance over depth, order over empathy, theory over tenderness. You begin to feel small in their presence, not because they belittle you, but because they dilute you. Your stories are absorbed into their narratives. Your tears become data. Your confusion becomes a philosophical topic for discussion. Jung warned that when a person identifies too strongly with the intellect or the ideal, they risk becoming cut off from the soul. And a soul disconnected from feeling becomes sterile, no matter how intelligent, principled, or articulate it may appear. This is the paradox of the cold idealist. They seek to save the world, but they cannot sit with one human being in silence and grief. If you've ever felt invisible around someone who seems profoundly aware, you're not imagining it. You are being bypassed, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, because they have traded their capacity to feel for the safety of perspective. And yet, connection cannot exist in ideas alone. It is forged in the uncomfortable space where logic falters and truth becomes embodied, where silence speaks more than solutions, where the gaze meets not a theory, but a person. To protect your own humanity, you must resist the trance of brilliance. Not all intelligence is relational, not all insight is intimacy, and not all who speak of light know how to hold the dark. Jung reminds us that wholeness includes the irrational, the wounded, the wild, the spontaneous. Not everything can be resolved. Not everything must make sense. And sometimes the greatest act of love is not to explain, but to stay. When you feel erased by someone's grand vision, remember, your existence does not require justification. You are not a concept. You are not a cause. You are not a lesson in someone else's narrative. You are a soul, and your pain is enough. Have you ever asked yourself why you attract the same kind of people? The takers, the critics, the manipulators. Why certain words cut so deep while others brush past you? Why you keep losing yourself in the same emotional traps over and over again? It's easy to blame the world. It's harder to look inward, and even harder to see what's hiding there. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is you. Not the you that performs, pleases, and achieves, but the unseen you, the one who hides behind smiles, behind strength, behind silence. Carl Jung called this hidden realm the shadow, everything you are but cannot yet accept. The shadow is not evil. It is unconscious. It holds your rage, your envy, your shame, your wounds, your raw hunger to be loved. It is every impulse you've denied to be good, every truth you've buried to be accepted, every boundary you've erased to be safe. And as long as you refuse to face it, it will run your life from the dark. You think the manipulator is outside of you. But part of you also manipulates to avoid rejection, to gain control, to secure love. You think the narcissist is the other. But part of you needs to be seen, admired, special. You think the victim is someone else. But part of you clings to your pain, retells your story, hopes that someone else will finally make it right. This is not condemnation. This is liberation. Because the moment you see it, truly see it, you are no longer ruled by it. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And fate, for many, is nothing more than unmetabolized pain, repeating itself in relationships, decisions, emotions, again and again. The shadow is not something to kill, it's something to integrate. That means listening to the parts of you you've silenced, allowing your anger to speak, not to harm but to inform, honoring your envy, not to act from it, but to understand what it's trying to show you, letting your sadness weep without explanation, letting your truth exist without apology. The moment you stop fighting your darkness, it stops fighting back. And in that space, something sacred returns. Choice, not reaction, not performance, not compulsive self-protection, but grounded, lucid choice, born from a self that is no longer fragmented. You begin to walk differently, speak differently, relate differently, not because others have changed, but because you are no longer looking for them to fix what you refuse to touch inside yourself. And yes, it's painful to see yourself clearly, to admit the damage you've done, to face the parts of you you swore you'd never become. But there is no real healing without that pain. There is no freedom without that confrontation. Because only when you embrace the shadow can you become whole. You are not just your light. You are your contradictions. You are the one who broke and the one who builds. You are the wound and the healer. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be real. And maybe, for the first time, that is enough. Don't forget, the next video is also part of this journey. It's important. You need to keep going.